Somehow my latest video was hour before going live, and Arena already managed to address it. What else I could expect from the evil mastermind behind the wheel? In their newest blog post, Arena went briefly over some changes that Paragon will receive coming the release that weren't mentioned in article we covered in previous video. These had to be consolidated into one paragraph, so likely there are going to be more changes coming release, and they just didn't fit. What we get addressed here first is the utility skills, commands. That's great, cause that's the only thing that won't completely unaddressed in article from last video. And what did they do? They put protection on brace yourselves. I understand that previous 3 months of Scourge meta wasn't enough time to learn anything. Okay, what else? They put adrenaline generation on it, and on heal skill, and on find their weakness. This hit me so out of left field I had to reread entire thing like 3 separate times. Paragon's adrenaline problems stemmed from the fact that mechanism of alacrity generation and the mechanism of protection generation are 2 completely separate mechanisms which both consume adrenaline separately. Using Staff 2 and Mace 2 of cooldown to generate adrenaline, and Burst Mastery, Versatile Rage and Invigorating Tempo to conserve your adrenaline, Paragon barely managed to meet the demand. This could be turned from barely manage to comfortably manage by either baking Invigorating Tempo into minor Grandmaster trait or by making Paragon less reliant on spamming chance of cooldown. And this is the little thing we like to call foreshadowing. Instead, Arena decided to essentially make 3 of the commands into Paragon's own version of Berserker's Rage skills, which I'm afraid will not fix the problem. When we need literal 1 tick of adrenaline every few seconds to meet the demand, getting a bunch of it on heal cast skill, which we want to keep for emergencies, and not just spam in our rotation, and adrenaline from which will be dumped all at once because we spam bursts, doesn't seem like the soundest of possible solutions. I'm afraid it will likely have negligible impact on PvE, and will only make potential side note bunker Paragon in PvP a little more likely to cause a ruckus. Especially if we consider potential protection and barrier output from Brace Yourselves, in tandem with Banner of Defense, Warhorn and Staff, which can combine into public nonsense. This, however, is almost likely to not touch the status quo of commands just not being used whatsoever. The more important changes are those to traits. From what we can read, Brisk Pacing, which was the trait that reduced cooldowns of commands when you cast commands, was baked into Feverish Pulse. As you know, the problem of having to spam commands too much is certainly going to be fixed by forcing the player to spam commands even more. And the problem, which was how both traits combined were structured, remains unchanged. If Arena reduces the amount of boons provided by this trait, as it is logical to assume they will, to keep in check the trait's power budget, it will make the player forced to spam commands even more to upkeep alacrity and in turn increase the demand for adrenaline. The exact opposite of what we should be striving for. Moreover, strengthening stanzas is moved into place Brisk Pacing used to be in, so it competes with Reverberation and Invigorating Tempo. And a new trait is placed into Grandmaster trait slot Strengthening Stanzas used to reside in. That trait will just give you damage increase proportional to your current motivation threshold. I see 2 problems with it. To generate alacrity, you already need Invigorating Tempo, and you will need it even more with previously mentioned Feverish Pulse changes. So no one who wills to generate alacrity is going to run stanzas, so once again, if you want to generate alacrity, you have to play full support, making Alac DPS pretty much as irrelevant as it was in the beta. Moreover, a trait that just gives you damage for sitting at high motivation is boring as fill the gaps yourself. DPS Paragon will just sit in Chant of Action for damage from stanzas, and because it costs the least motivation. And it will play exactly like Spellbreaker does, but without the safety of full counter, without the boon rip, without option to damage break bars with mage brain tethers if the need arises. Congratulations! You successfully made slightly shitter Spellbreaker yet again. And here's the funny thing. This new trait is what they call a trait with a bit more active gameplay, where keeping motivation at high threshold is what Paragon does by default for simply existing, because all adrenaline expenditure gives motivation. And so do offhand skills, meaning we are likely to be at high threshold simply through power of face rolling across the keyboard, especially if you sit in chant of action due to strengthening stanzas. You remember the old Berserker's power that gave you damage buff for sitting at high adrenaline? This is exactly that, except brain-dead. Fun. In total, previewed command changes are likely not to do anything, especially considering no one in fucking history of mankind is going to run Reverberation once it competes with both strengthening stanzas and invigorating tempo, on top of which commands were underpowered with previous Reverberation active, so they will definitely still be underpowered without it, and probably with it still, so no one will run a single one, except healing one in PvE raids, and even that is uncertain now, because with brisk pacing baked into Feverish Pulse, adrenaline cost of spamming chants to upkeep Alacrity might skyrocket just high enough to force players into using to the limit for adrenaline generation alone. Alac DPS is still dead because you'll still have to forgo both DPS traits to upkeep Alacrity, and full DPS, if numerically viable, will most likely be indistinguishable in playstyle from Spellbreaker, just with less utility, so probably a direct downgrade. For versus modes the impact is much more difficult to predict. You need less adrenaline, and you can get away with running traits like Merciless Hammer for its generation, but I can't help but wonder what the actual is going to happen when you get to Pulse Quickness at the rate which new Feverish Pulse will potentially allow for. Oddly enough, we're even more likely to receive the full Spear Spellbreaker release fiasco once again. But even more embarrassing, as unless a miracle is going to happen, or unless there's something behind the scene we're still uninformed about, Paragon's main problems will not be fixed prior to release, and in certain places they might even become worse. I guess only path ArenaNet is willing to take is path through torture. But hey, there is still 2 weeks until release. Just enough time for one miracle. As always, a big sign of gratitude to all the generous supporters, continuously considering my dubious quality content worth their money. You're all truly welcome. Crabface out.